My name is Camille, and today I will be discussing the effects that masturbation has on sex. We'll see. Okay, so first I wanted to start by kind of defining masturbation. In more recent studies, researchers have found that the term masturbation is not actually that clearly defined. There's just not a lot of research on it. So in this article, they have essentially defined it as self-pleasuring behavior, and then they had a masturbation scale labeling whether a participant thought something was considered a behavior was considered masturbation or not considered masturbation. And just to talk about a few of these, they mention touching or stroking genitals with hand for pleasure, using a vibrator, using the shower jet water, rubbing genitals against an object, and touching, stroking, stimulating your breast or chest for pleasure. And so that just kind of gave me a better understanding and basis for where to go with the rest of my presentation. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of masturbation as well as its implications and the way people do it per se. And then here I'm going to kind of go over why people masturbate. So in this study, there were implications that they discuss the implications that masturbation can have in monogamous relationships. And the author from Minnie McBride talks about why people masturbate. She says, masturbation is widely acknowledged as a normal and healthy sexual behavior that provides physical release and psychological relief. And I think that this is a super big point to bring up, that for a lot of people, it's actually very healthy to masturbate. And it's a great way to provide that release. But then for many also goes on to talk about loneliness. And she says a lot of men and women that find themselves in these circumstances turn to masturbation as a way to cope with those feelings. So that is also a reason for why people masturbate, and it's just become a bigger problem, the loneliness that we have in the world since COVID and technology. And then she says women are more likely to masturbate if they have been disconnected from the relational communication process in sexuality, experiencing increased isolation and disparity. So a lot of women masturbate simply because they're lacking that emotional intimacy. So there was another study done in 2002 by Debbie Herbenick. She essentially conducted a survey with adults to, one, assess the prevalence and frequency of people participating in masturbation in the past year, and then discuss the reasons why people gave for masturbating and for not masturbating. So she examined the association between masturbation frequency and actual desired partnered sex frequency in the prior year. So some of her findings are super important. She talks about why people masturbate and says, sexual expression, learning about bodies in ways that help people explore their sexuality. And then she says it is included in some therapeutic treatment plans for sexual difficulties, which I think is super interesting, such as premature ejaculation, experiencing orgasm, expressing love for oneself, being horny to relieve stress, to help someone fall asleep. So there are a lot of interesting findings. And then she also just reports that men report greater prevalence, frequency, and recency in masturbation. But that is not to say that women do not masturbate. I just wanted to make that clear. And so now I'll talk about the effects of masturbation. I kind of go back to from Minnie McBride's article. And she talks about a lot of different things. She says there is distress and impairment in various aspects of life, so not just in your sexual life. The frequent consumption of pornography combined with compulsive masturbation can create a cycle of behavior that is difficult to break, so it's addictive, or at least can be. Reduction in intimacy, relational stability, emotional distance, potential harm of recommending solitary masturbation on relational health, isolation, and its contribution to rising divorce rates and declined marriage stability. So there's a lot of harm in masturbation that I think people probably don't see as much because they don't view it that way. So now I'm going to delve a little deeper into the relationship between masturbation and sex with this article by Killick. They have great research into masturbation and sexual satisfaction. Some of the most important things that were addressed here are that rather than the absence of sexual problems, definitions of sexual satisfaction include personal sexual well being and aspects of the dyadic relationships, such as presence of mutuality, orgasm, romance, creativity, and pleasure. So, obviously, masturbation will affect sexual satisfaction because, as we know, sex was always meant to be relational. That's how Heavenly Father created it. So when someone masturbates alone, obviously they might be experiencing physical pleasure, but also lacking in a lot of those other realms. And then in the second quote, it says, for women, higher masturbation frequency has been associated with lower overall sexual relationship satisfaction and lower satisfaction during partnered sex, and also less orgasm difficulty and greater orgasmic pleasure during masturbation. So this one I have some thoughts on. This article treats masturbation as a symptom. The reason women often masturbate isn't because they necessarily want to, but just because they're lacking in maybe a different area of their sexual life or the emotional intimacy of their relationship. But then the orgasm part's also interesting in that, there's obviously couples, as we've learned, that don't have healthy ways to communicate about desire or arousal patterns. And if women are able to experience more orgasm in masturbation, they clearly know what is stimulating to their body. So again, I feel like in a lot of these situations, learning how to communicate and cope with, the loneliness and really discover why you're masturbating, it is a lot easier to create that vulnerability in a relationship and be able to communicate and actually have sexual satisfaction. So this is continued effects of masturbation. This was a research or a study done by Oscar Sedvia. He studies the relationship between solo masturbation and sexual satisfaction. Just an important note to make is that he uses 3 different 7-point scales that range from good to bad, satisfying to unsatisfying, and valuable to worthless in regards to sexual satisfaction. And here are just some interesting findings from his research. He finds that a higher frequency of masturbation is associated with poorer sexual satisfaction in both men and women. So that obviously answers our question. In men, a positive relationship is observed between the frequency of masturbation and being dissatisfied with their overall sex life again. In men, more frequent masturbation is associated with more difficulty reaching an orgasm and more symptoms of retarded ejaculation, so that can create a lot of frustration in the bedroom. People who masturbate may exhibit a strong autoerotic orientation, which could make this behavior more gratifying than sexual relationships. So if, you're able to turn that part of yourself on by yourself, why do you need to be in a relationship? And then men report more solitary sexual desire than women. And in the exploration of the distinction between being single or in a relationship, it has been observed that in the 2 studies, focusing exclusively on single individuals, no significant association between masturbation and sexual satisfaction was found, while in the studies that considered exclusively samples of couples, they found a positive, negative, or not relation. Which just goes to show that there are a lot of negative consequences of masturbation on sexual satisfaction and the sexual relationship or relationship overall. And I just thought the last quote was so interesting that I kind of want to delve a little bit deeper into that, the masturbation versus being single or in a partnered relationship. And this was a study done by Sija Huang on over 12,000 Finnish men and women who completed a survey on masturbation. So in the article, he kind of prefaces a lot of terms and talks about masturbation being a manipulation of one's own genitals. The act is usually accompanied by sexual fantasies or literature that may also include the use of mechanical devices or self-stimulation. And I thought the word manipulate was very interesting because I feel like it is almost tricking our body into doing something that it's not supposed to do by itself. But I think the important factor here is the studying of the relational effects, and the results from this study indicated that masturbation was positively associated with overall sexual function for women. This was moderated by relationship status, meaning that more frequent masturbation was associated with better functioning and orgasm and sexual satisfaction for women, whereas the opposite was true for women who were in relationships, and the same for men. When they were masturbating more, they had better erectile function and better ejaculatory latency, and worse orgasmic function, and intercourse satisfaction and more delayed ejaculation for men in a relationship. So it's very interesting to see that it's very relational. Sex is very relational, and participating in sexual behaviors outside of those marriage bonds is very damaging, not only to your mind and that side of intimacy, but also just to your body. Like, you see that your body doesn't react the same. So the last thing I kind of want to address here are the church's views on masturbation. And President Kimball, in one of his books, talks about masturbation and says, being pushed by pleasure, they will become more and more distant from joy. Their kind of fulfillment will produce a hollowness and an emptiness from which no fleeting pleasure can finally rescue them. And then he just talks about how masturbation is a sin that can lead to greater sins of pornography, and for some, even abortion of an unborn child. And so he kind of just says, it just leads to more secrecy and loneliness, and it doesn't solve the problem. And it just says it is considered sexual immorality, and says if sex is relational in nature, then masturbation will affect the relationship. So I kind of just want to end with an invitation by Vaughn J. Featherstone, which he gave many years ago, but he just says and invites us all to be pure in heart, and he says that the sex urge does not have to be satisfied. That is Satan's old lie, that it does have to be satisfied. And I think we've learned that in class, that we are judged by our behaviors, and we don't have to act on these impulses, and we have the willpower. That urge doesn't have to be satisfied, and we can transmute it into other things and hobbies and different things. So I just invite everyone to be pure of heart, and thank you for listening.